The big cities don't want you to think about this, but for every booming Carolina suburb you see on the news, there's a quiet rural town losing the very people who built it. And today I'm counting down the 12 real reasons why they're leaving, the forces that hollow these towns out, and the genuinely surprising ways some of them are fighting their way back. See, there's a story unfolding across both Carolinas that rarely makes the headlines because it's the opposite of a boom. While Charlotte and Raleigh and the coast explode with growth, a whole set of small towns is slowly, quietly emptying out. The numbers are stark. Roughly 1/3 of North Carolina's rural counties are projected to be smaller in 2030 than they are today, and some counties in the PD region of South Carolina could lose as much as 30% of their population within a couple of decades. But here's what makes this worth your time. This isn't a story about bad places or bad people. It's a story about powerful forces, and about the towns refusing to go quietly. There's a town the interstate erased almost overnight that still refuses to disappear. There's a historic community flooded so badly its people had to fight their way back to higher ground. There's a billion-dollar bet quietly bringing young families back to the country. And there's one root cause behind all the others. So let's count them down, all the way to the biggest reason of all, and end on the reasons for hope. So hit that subscribe button now because we're counting all 12 of these down, and you do not want to miss number 1. Let's count it down. Number 12, the highway that passed them by. When I first drove into some of these forgotten towns, I noticed they all had one thing in common. They sit just off the beaten path on a road the modern world stopped using. Here's the reason. For generations, small towns lived and died by their access, the railroad depot and the 2-lane highway that carried travelers through. And when the interstates were built, they often bypassed these towns by a few crucial miles, and the traffic, the travelers, and the money simply vanished. The clearest example in the whole country sits in South Carolina, where a town that once thrived on a busy tourist route to Florida was gutted almost overnight when Interstate 95 was built miles away, taking every passing car with it. When you're cut off from the flow of people and commerce, decline becomes almost gravitational. But notice this. The towns that survive isolation are the ones that give people a new reason to make the trip. A festival, a river, a downtown worth the detour. Access built these towns. Losing it started the slide. And once that slide begins, it tends to feed on itself. Fewer travelers means fewer businesses, which means fewer jobs, which means fewer people, which means even fewer reasons for anyone new to stop. Number 11, the death of Main Street. When I first walked the downtowns of these struggling towns, the empty storefronts told the whole story. Here's the reason. For a century, the local Main Street was the beating heart of a small town, the hardware store, the diner, the department store, the place everyone gathered. Then came the big box stores on the edge of town, and then online shopping, and one by one those local shops couldn't compete, boarding up their windows and taking the town's gathering places with them. A dead Main Street isn't just an economic loss, it's the loss of a community's living room, the place that made a town feel like a town. But here's the fight back, and it's real. Some of the smartest small towns have poured energy into reviving their downtowns, filling old storefronts with breweries, coffee shops, and local restaurants, turning Main Street back into a destination. The towns winning today figured out that you can't beat the big boxes on price, so you beat them on character instead. A restored theater, a farmer's market, a walkable block of local shops, these are things Amazon can never ship to your door. When a town gives people a reason to gather again, the money and the pride start to follow. A living Main Street won't fix everything, but it's often the visible first sign that a town has decided to fight. Number 10, the schools left behind. When I first started asking families why they left, one answer came up again and again. The schools. Here's the reason. Rural counties often lack the tax base to fund their schools the way wealthy suburbs can, and as state investment in education has shifted, small-town school systems have struggled with aging buildings, fewer programs, and teacher shortages. When ambitious young parents look at a rural school and a suburban one, many make the heartbreaking choice to move for their kids' sake. And every family that leaves shrinks the tax base further, which strains the schools even more, a vicious cycle. This one cuts deep, because a good school is often the single biggest thing keeping young families in a rural town. The places fighting back are the ones investing hard in their schools despite the odds, because they understand a simple truth. Save the school, and you have a real shot at saving the town. Lose it, and the young families follow. And when a rural district is forced to consolidate, closing the small-town school and busing kids an hour away to a county campus, It often rips out one of the last threads holding a community together because that school was the Friday night football, the graduation, the shared heartbeat of the whole place. Number 9. The farms that needed fewer hands. When I first drove through the old tobacco and cotton country of the Eastern Carolinas, I passed field after field with almost nobody working them. Here's the reason. These towns were built on agriculture, tobacco, cotton, and the armies of people it took to plant and harvest them. But as farming mechanized, a job that once took 100 workers came to take a handful, and when tobacco farming collapsed after federal buyouts ended the old system, the economic engine of entire regions simply switched off. The land still produces, but it no longer needs the people, and so the people left. This is the quiet story of the rural PD in eastern North Carolina. Not a dramatic factory closing, but a slow draining away of the jobs that once filled these towns. The farms didn't disappear. They just stopped needing a town's worth of hands to run them. And a town without work is a town people eventually leave. Number 8. The one big factory that closed. When I first visited these old mill and manufacturing towns, I kept finding the same ghost. One enormous empty building that used to be everything. Here's the reason. So many small Carolina towns were built around a single dominant employer. A textile mill, a furniture plant, a factory that employed half the town. It was a good life while it lasted. But when that industry moved overseas or shut its doors, there was no backup plan, and a town that had bet everything on one company suddenly had nothing. The paychecks vanished, the young workers scattered to find jobs, and the town was left with a hollowed-out shell. This is the single most common decline story in the Carolinas. But it's also where some of the most inspiring comebacks are happening, as a few of these towns have managed to lure entirely new industries onto the bones of the old ones. The lesson these places learned the hard way: never let your whole town depend on a single employer again. The smartest survivors have spread their bets, courting a mix of smaller companies, small businesses, and remote workers instead of praying for one giant savior to ride in. It's slower and less glamorous than landing one big plant, but it's far more durable, because no single closure can ever gut the whole town again. Number 7. The floods that kept coming. This one is different, and it deserves real respect because for some towns the threat isn't economic, it's the water itself. When I first learned the story of Princeville, North Carolina, I was genuinely moved. Here's the reason. Princeville, the oldest town in America chartered by formerly enslaved people, sits in a low bowl right beside the Tar River, and it has been devastated by catastrophic flooding again and again, submerged under more than 20 feet of water after Hurricane Floyd in 1999, and flooded once more by Hurricane Matthew in 2016, which destroyed hundreds of homes. After each disaster, the town's population was cut nearly in half as families who lost everything simply couldn't face rebuilding in harm's way. That's the teaser I promised you. A historic community flooded almost out of existence. But here's the fight back, and it's powerful. Refusing to let their history be erased, Princeville's residents secured millions in federal grants and are building a resilient new section of town on higher ground, determined to preserve their heritage while protecting their future. It is one of the most stirring examples of a community's will to survive that you will find anywhere. If you're learning things about the Carolinas you never expected, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people just like you. Number 6. The hospital that closed its doors. When I first mapped out where people were leaving fastest, I noticed how often it lined up with one thing: a lost hospital. Here's the reason. Rural hospitals across America are in genuine crisis, with more than 40% operating at a loss and many forced to close entirely, and both Carolinas have seen rural hospitals shut their doors. When the local hospital closes, it's not just an inconvenience, it's a matter of life and death, turning a quick trip to the emergency room into an hour-long drive. And for older residents especially, losing nearby healthcare is often the final push to move away for good. A hospital anchors a community in a way people don't appreciate until it's gone. It's jobs, it's safety, it's the reason a retiree feels comfortable staying. The towns fighting back are battling hard to keep their clinics and hospitals open, or to partner with bigger systems, because they understand that in a rural town, healthcare isn't just healthcare, it's survival, and it's a reason to stay. And the ripple effects are enormous. A hospital is often one of a rural county's largest employers, so when it closes, the town doesn't just lose its doctors and nurses. It loses hundreds of good jobs and one of the biggest reasons it feels safe to grow old there. Number 5. The internet that never arrived. When I first talked to people who'd left small towns for the city, a surprising number mentioned something modern. They simply couldn't get online. Here's the reason. For years, high-speed internet stopped at the edge of the cities and suburbs, leaving vast stretches of rural Carolina with slow, unreliable service or none at all, which meant no remote work, no telehealth, no online school, and no way to run a modern business from the countryside. In a world that increasingly runs on connectivity, being unplugged was another reason to leave. But this is where the story turns genuinely hopeful. That's the teaser I promised you. $1 billion bet on the country. North Carolina alone is pouring well over $1 billion into rural broadband, with projects set to connect hundreds of thousands of rural homes and businesses. And that changes everything, because once a rural town has fast internet, a remote worker can suddenly live there, enjoying the low costs and the quiet while earning a big city salary. Broadband may be the single most powerful tool these towns have to reverse their decline. Think about what it unlocks. A young couple can keep their city salaries while buying a cheap house on a quiet country road. A rural doctor's office can offer telehealth. A kid can do homework without driving to a library parking lot for a signal, and a local maker can suddenly sell to the whole world. For the first time in decades, the countryside can compete with the city on something that actually matters to young families. That's why so many people are calling fast rural internet the great equalizer. Number 4, the belief that nothing good happens here. When I first sat down with local leaders in some of these towns, they told me the hardest thing to fight isn't economic at all, but it's a feeling. Here's the reason. As one PD official put it, there's often a quiet sense of apathy in a long struggling town, a belief that nothing good ever happens here and nothing ever will. That mindset becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Talented young people assume there's no future for them and leave, and their leaving makes the town feel even emptier and more hopeless. Perception becomes reality. This is the invisible reason behind so many of the others, and it may be the hardest to break. But it's also the cheapest to fix because it costs nothing to change a story. The towns fighting back are the ones rebuilding their own pride, rebranding themselves, celebrating what they do have, and refusing to accept decline as their identity. Sometimes the first step to saving a town is simply convincing its own people that it's worth saving. It sounds soft, but it's the foundation everything else is built on, because no one invests in a place they've given up on. Not the young family deciding whether to stay, not the entrepreneur deciding where to open, not the town itself deciding whether to try. The comebacks almost always start with a handful of stubborn believers who refuse to write the obituary. Pride is free, it's contagious, and in a struggling town, it's often the very first thing that has to come back. Number 3, the economy that never modernized. When I first compared the towns that recovered to the ones that didn't, the difference was clear. It was all about what came next. Here's the reason. When the mills and the farms and the factories faded, some towns managed to build a new economy on the ruins of the old one, and some never did. The ones that got stuck, waiting for the old jobs to somehow come back, watched their people drain away year after year. But the comeback stories here are genuinely thrilling. One old Carolina mill town replaced its shuttered textile factory with a massive biotechnology research campus, drawing scientists where the looms once ran. Another is betting its entire second act on the return of a wild river and the tourists it brings. The towns that reinvent themselves around science, around recreation, around the arts are the ones that survive. The towns that only look backward are the ones that fade. Reinvention isn't easy, but it's the difference between a comeback and a ghost town. And the towns that pull it off tend to build their new economy on something they already have that the cities can't copy: a beautiful river, a rich history, cheap land, a walkable old downtown, a location near a growing metro. The old jobs are never coming back, and the towns that finally accept that are the ones free to chase the next thing. Nostalgia feels like loyalty, but for a dying town, it can be the most dangerous trap of all. Number 2, more funerals than births. And number 2 is the quietest and most relentless reason of all, the one that works in the background of everything else. When I first looked at the raw demographics of these towns, the numbers were sobering. Here's the reason. As young people leave and the population that stays grows older, rural towns reach a grim tipping point where they begin to have more deaths than births each year, what demographers call natural decrease. Once a town crosses that line, it can be shrinking, even if not a single additional person moves away, simply because the math of an aging population catches up with it. This is the slow, silent engine of rural decline, and it's accelerating as the population ages. It's also the hardest reason to reverse, because you can't quickly conjure young families out of thin air, but you can attract them. And the towns that pull in young newcomers, whether through jobs, affordability, or that new broadband connection, are the ones that stop the clock. The rest simply run out of time. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about the real story of these places. So do yourself a favor and hit that like button, then let's get to number 1. Number 1, the young people who leave. And the number 1 reason, the force behind nearly every other reason on this list, is heartbreakingly simple. The young people leave, and too often, they don't come back. When I first talked to families across rural Carolina, this was the wound underneath everything. Here's the reason. For generations now, the brightest, most ambitious young people in these small towns have grown up, looked around, and concluded that their future lies somewhere else, in Charlotte, in Raleigh, in Greenville, in any city with the jobs, the opportunities, and the excitement that a small town simply can't match. They leave for college and never return. And when a town loses its young people, it loses everything that follows them. The babies they would have had, the businesses they would have started, the energy and the tax base and the future they represented. Every other reason on this list, the closed factory, the struggling school, the aging population, either causes this exodus or is caused by it. This is the engine of the entire story. But here's why I saved it for number 1 and why this video does not end in despair. Because that engine is starting, in places, to run in reverse. Demographers have a name for it: brain gain. Across rural North Carolina, there's growing evidence of young families choosing to move back to the countryside, drawn by lower costs, by the chance to raise kids near grandparents, by the freedom that remote work and new broadband finally make possible. Half of America's rural counties are actually gaining population again, and the ones winning are the ones near lakes, mountains, coastlines, and growing cities, or the ones bold enough to reinvent themselves. The young people left because the opportunities did. Bring the opportunities back, and the young people can follow. So line all 12 of these up, and the truth is bigger than any single reason. Rural Carolina isn't dying because its people failed, but it's caught in powerful economic and demographic currents that have pulled at small towns for 50 years. The lost jobs, the lost hospital, the lost school, the young who left, the funerals that outnumber the births. But decline is not destiny. Everywhere I looked, I found towns refusing to accept the ending everyone predicted for them. Princeville rebuilding on higher ground, old mill towns luring science and industry, dead main streets coming back to life, and fast internet quietly opening the door for a new generation to come home. These places were built by people who chose to stay against the odds, and their story isn't over. It's just waiting to be written by whoever's brave enough to bet on them next. So if this video gave you a new appreciation for the small towns that built the Carolinas, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment telling me about a small town you think deserves a comeback. I read every single one. And if this video hits 15,000 likes, I'll do a part 2 on the rural towns that are already winning their fight back. I'll see you in the next.